Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and happy International Day of Peace. Each year on September 21st, the United Nations celebrates this day and chooses a theme that they encourage individuals, groups, and organizations to explore together. This year's theme is End Racism, Build Peace. And I am so pleased to report that our new colleague, Gwendolyn Purifoye, has pulled together a stellar panel for us to mark this occasion. In addition to her, Dr. Derrick Brooms, who's a professor of sociology and Africana studies at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and Larry Simmons, who is a youth community engagement consultant, are going to be participating in today's panel. And I just wanted to take a few moments to talk a little bit about Gwendolyn. This is she just recently arrived here to Notre Dame's campus, and many of you may have not met her or don't know a lot about her, but we're really excited to have her here as part of the faculty. And she's an assistant professor of racial justice and conflict transformation at Keough School of Global Affairs. And she's also a core member of the Keough School's Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. And she's also a faculty fellow at the Kroc Institute for Civil and Human Rights. Her research focuses on investigations of how material infrastructure, transportation systems, and spatiality shape the experience of racially and class marginalized individuals and communities. As an urban ethnographer, Purifoye has spent several years conducting extensive fieldwork in Chicago, Washington, DC, Newark, where she examines the lived experiences of Black and Brown folks in public spaces and neighborhoods. This fall, she was awarded a visiting faculty fellowship at Brown University Center for Race, the study of race and ethnicity in America, to research how Blacks are experiencing the current redevelopment boom in Newark after enduring decades of widespread systemic racism and disinvestment. Her first book, Race in Motion, Public Transportation in Restricted Mobile Spaces, uses ethnographic and archival data to examine how public transportation is used to support persistent inequalities and inequalities that are race, spatial, material, social, and embodied. This book presents her research that shows that although some may think that public transportation exemplifies racial progress in the United States, after all, Blacks no longer have to sit at the back of the bus, public transportation continues to have separate and unequal experience. Before she came to Notre Dame, she was an associate professor at North Park University, where in Chicago. She earned her Ph.D. in sociology from Loyola University of Chicago. In addition to her academic research, she works directly with community organizations, regional and planning agencies, including the Metropolitan Planning Council and the Regional Transportation Authority. She's currently a member of the Practice Advisory Board for the City of Chicago's UN Safe Cities Project, where she provides expertise as a member of Gender-Based Violence Research Advisory Group. And she will be teaching next semester here, so I encourage you all to check out her classes. I was able to see her when she gave her job talk here at Notre Dame, and her work is incredibly interesting, and I think will be something that you guys will all be enriched by with her being here. So I'm going to turn the mic over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing?
Good afternoon.
So we've had a fun morning and afternoon. All right, so I've been waiting for our panelists for a minute, and some lovely person sent them into town to the Kroc building or foundation, center. So so they've been roaming the earth for a little bit, but we're so glad they made it in. They got the chance to know each other for a little bit, so that's all great and fine. So thank you, Aaron, and so glad that everyone has been able to make it, and I'm really pleased at this opportunity to discuss this topic with faculty, staff, and students here at Notre Dame. I want to begin by introducing our panelists. One of our panelists, Dr. Janine De Navas, was not able to make it. She had an emergency, but we want to give a shout out to her for all the preparation that she did for us. So I'm going to begin on the end there with Dr. Derrick Brooms, who is a native of the city of Chicago. He's from the South Side. South Side. He does his research, his activism, and praxis. He primarily focuses on Black communities, educational equality, and racial justice. Currently, he serves as a professor of Africana studies and sociology, and is a fellow in the Center for the Study of Social Justice at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. He also serves as a youth worker, is a senior research associate for this, excuse me, the California State University Young Males of Color Consortium, where he works with colleagues across all 23 campuses and is an award-winning educator and scholar. Primarily, his research investigates Black boys and men's lived experiences and educational pathways. Dr. Brooms is the author of several books, yes, several, including Stakes is High, which is his newest one, Trials, Lessons, and Triumphs of Young Black Men's Educational Journeys. Also, and that was published in 2021, Being Black, Being Male on Campus, Understanding and Confronting Black Male Collegiate Experiences. And he is the co-editor of Living Racism Through the Barrel of the Book. But he's also the founding editor of the Critical Race Studies in Education book series with SUNY Press. Dr. Brooms has been acknowledged with Community Spirit Award, a Presidential Exemplary Multicultural Teaching Award, the Jacqueline Jackson Early Career Scholar Award from the Association of Black Sociologists. He has received numerous faculty awards. He received outstanding faculty awards as well. And he has been acknowledged on numerous occasions for his mentoring work with undergraduate and graduate students. Dr. Brooms currently is working on a new book project focused on Black men's experiences and sense-making of gendered anti-Blackness in the United States. So let's welcome him to Notre Dame.
Excuse me. Let me just say, I sent in a really short biography, and Gwen told me, no, that's not acceptable. So all of that stuff she read is because she made me send it. So I just want y'all to know.
I did. I was like, seriously, this is what you're gonna give me? So, right? So now I want to introduce to you Mr. Larry Simmons, who is a West Baltimore native. Mr. Simmons is deeply committed to improving the health, the wellness, and the economic vibrancy of Baltimore neighborhoods. He is youth and community engagement consultant. He is also the community director for Nobody Asked Me campaign, which is in conjunction with Johns Hopkins University. And he's also the president of the Larry Simmons consulting firm. He has devoted his professional life to serving communities across the city of Baltimore. As a natural advocate, which he really is how I got to know him well, Larry is known for his ability to expose injustice while holding himself and others accountable to create alternative solutions. As a connector, he easily navigates through the often siloed city initiatives that happen in Baltimore. He bridges gaps and often bringing non-traditional stakeholders and leaders together in actual partnership. He is a valued and very respected member of the community and a community leader, using his influence and reach to advance community engagement and advocacy for those who need it most. With 20 plus years of experience, which is interesting because he's only 35, in directing youth and community development programs, community organizing, coordinating citywide services and program initiatives, Mr. Simmons also has been a constant and consistent presence in the city. He has dedicated his career to the young people of Baltimore. Mr. Simmons believes that the future of his community and all communities, it depends on the success of our children. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Larry Simmons here to Notre Dame. So what we're going to do is I've prepared a series of questions that they're going to answer, and then we're going to, of course, leave space for questions from the audience. I'm going to sit down, if that's okay with y'all. Yeah, you need me to stand up. Okay. All right. It's hot in here. We'll like go down just a little bit. So let's begin with the first question. And as needed, since Dr. De Navas is not here, I may occasionally have something to say. But anyway. Well, see, don't start. All right, so I will start, and either one of you can chime in, but if you can just tell us a little bit more about who you are, but how do you see your work and your passions connected to the work of ending racism, both nationally and globally, because it is not just a US problem, even though it is very unique in the United States opposed to how it has developed elsewhere.
I'll let you start first.
Oh, okay. So
Don't forget to speak into the mic too.
Oh, yeah, sorry. So I'm also the chair of the Parent and Community Advisory Board of Baltimore City Public Schools, and serve in a couple of other capacities as board of director members in different spaces. But the work that we do specifically with Nobody Asked Me and in other places that I've kind of worked, we're really pushing to work with young people and families as partners in their own success. Am I close enough to the mic?
Yeah.
Partners in their own success, right? And so I think that by helping folks to become independent, by bridging and building relationships, kind of like this, right? So in the work that I do, I'm the community organizer working with academia, right? And so it's this awesome marriage between academics and community folks that are finally coming together to partner to do the much needed work, right? So we oftentimes as community organizers and programmers kind of spend a lot of our time with us and our kids and the neighborhoods and the people that we work with. And then the academics kind of spend their time with them, right? And really not ever connecting, right? So sometimes the information and the plans and the opportunities stay in these different places. And so what we've been able to do is to really think about, one, how we value Black children and how we value brown children. Like that, once we can define what that value is, then that helps to push our work. And by bridging these two different groups of folks who are working on the ground and then the folks who are working in the policy space together has really been powerful. And we hope to continue that kind of work and really be an example to other systems who oftentimes don't work together.
Thanks for that, Larry. So I asked Larry to go first because we were, as Gwendolyn, Dr. Purifoye mentioned, we had a chance to chat in the car as we drove around South Bend and checking out some sites. And one of the things that Larry talked about was that unnecessary divide between what might be the academy, higher education, and people. And so I'm really excited to just even have conversation with Larry, not only in this panel, but in even broader sense, because at the root of all of my work is how do we create better conditions for people to thrive?
Yeah.
Right. And so clearly one person can't do all things. And so I don't try to solve a lot of things in my work, but I really just take this kind of hyper focus on what would it mean if we had schooling environments where Black youth, Black children, Black adults had these possibilities put in front of them as opposed to limitations. Yeah. And so I grew up, just a really quick backstory, I grew up on the south side of Chicago. In my freshman class, we had 334 students. So as a ninth grader, we had 334 students. When we graduated, we had 99, right? And so when I think about educational equity, when I think about racial justice, this is very much rooted in the communities and the neighborhoods and the people that I grew up with, and we still see this happening today. And so as I think about my contributions to ending racism, I think we have to take both the micro and the macro level approach. I think we also have to think about it from a meso system, and that's kind of what I was thinking about when Larry shared, and that is part of my work is not just about writing publications, and of course I've written books, that's kind of part of what academics do, if you will. I'll never you'll never hear me call myself an academic, you'll never hear me call myself a scholar. I try to do work that matters to people, right? And so, one thing we get caught up on in higher education and the academy in particular is like citation counts and how many people are citing your work. I try to put the focus on my work. Will this impact people's lives, right? And so writing a book publication, just as an example, is just one little small unit of work that we do. It is really rooted in how can I take this and engage with folks in the schools? How can I engage with people in the community and kind of help them develop the language to articulate to others what some of the challenges, struggles, and boundaries and limitations might be. But then also on the student and family side, how do we help them advocate for the things that they need, the things that they desire? And so some of my work is really geared at really trying to clearly identify, make it plain, as Malcolm X would say, right? The evils that we're kind of up against, if we were to use that language. But really, what are some of the challenges that we're up against? And so one of the things that I see as a premise of my work in looking at Black boys and men's lived experiences are the very real ways in which so many institutions and organizations collude for their demise, right? So what does it mean when a 16-year-old is taught or told that because he's from a particular neighborhood, you're not gonna be anything but like those guys on the corner, right? And that's saying two things is very impactful. One is making an assumption about who those guys on the corner are and who they can be. And then it's also delimiting to that individual who just happened to be passing through that neighborhood is not a member of the neighborhood. So in what ways do we even dissociate young people from the neighborhoods that they're in and we get to college, right? So this is what I was told in college. Look to the person to the left of you, look to the person to the right of you. One of those people won't be here when you graduate. Wow, that's great for me to hear as a 18-year-old freshman, right? Because I'm thinking two people are looking at me.
Yeah, right.
And so my work is really rooted at how do we change conditions so that I can look to the person to the left of me and look to the person to the right of me and say, in what ways is their success yoked to my success, right? And so when I think about this work that I'm doing, and Gwendolyn mentioned, Dr. Purifoye mentioned this new book project, I've struggled to write this book. I've been trying to write it for 6 years. Because when we were talking about Freddie Gray in the car. I could talk to you all about Laquan McDonald. I could talk to you about Sandra Bland, Breonna Taylor, Renisha McBride. I can talk to you about Breonna Taylor. I can talk to you about Tony McDade, right? And even though I've never been to the point of a fatal interaction with a police officer, right? There are very real, visceral ways that I experience interactions with police, even if I don't interact with them, right? And so there's a way that Black folk in particular, and other folks, but I'm just thinking about my work, there's a way that we carry this weight of racism in our lived experiences that's killing us even when it's not killing us, right? Higher levels of cortisol, higher levels of stress, right? Ways in which we might inflict violence on each other, right? And I'm thinking about a young brother named Darius Hollins, who's from Chicago, who was one of my students when I taught in Chicago, was just killed 2 nights ago, right? And so this is not work, me trying to philosophize and pontificate. This is people's lives, so that when I'm working with people and they're sharing with me through some of the research that I do, it is an honor to carry their stories and try to share those with other people so that we can work collectively and collaboratively to create better conditions for people's lives. And I think about that on a local level here, if I might think about Chicago or Knoxville or Cincinnati. I used to work at the University of Cincinnati, or we can think about that globally, right? So what does it mean to be a young Black male or a young Black person in the rural areas of Jamaica, right? Where schooling might not be accessible, right? Or what, et cetera. So you can see where I can go with that, right? And we can kind of draw that out in a larger scheme of things. So I'm really thinking about how do we rearrange the relationships of institutions, not only to communities, but to people, so that the people see these as potential opportunities so that our institutions will quit doing harm to other folks.
I keep forgetting. I'm sorry. We had a presentation last night, so nobody asked me, is this project that my colleague and I, Dr. Lofton, have been running for the last 2 years of really centering the voices of young people and their families when it comes to the services and experiences in Baltimore City, right? And you hit me hard just now, because I'm constantly talking about this state of violence that young people are constantly in, especially young people who are of color, right? From the time you wake up to the time you step out your house to the time you get on an MTA, so the public transportation. In Baltimore, we don't have school bus, we don't have yellow school buses, so kids have to ride the regular public
City
transportation
bus, yeah,
with everybody else. So that's all that craziness is happening. Then you get off the bus, you got some more craziness, and you get into school and you got somebody hit you with, where's your homework, right? And just constantly thinking about that, that weight that not only young people, but people my age too. We all, people of color have been so used to carrying that weight that oftentimes young people don't even really focus on it, right? It's just something that just exists, and then finally something happens because of all of that stuff, right? Something crazy happens. But I think that for us to do this work is really to acknowledge that, and then to acknowledge our own complicitness in all of that. That as much as we all have this conversation, these conversations about equity, we are still very privileged to have those conversations. And so, I don't know, I just wanted to just kind of jump in, because that was just really kind of...
Right. No, and that's good. Thank you, both. So when we think about exactly what Dr. Brooms and Mr. Simmons are saying, one of the things that we see, like racism itself is just like this ideology, right? That's born from this idea of race, but then it becomes activated, right? That it gets acted out in a variety of different ways in communities, but it begins at the institutional level. We know that racism has this historical element, but as they both mentioned, it is also embodied. And it is exposed and it is experienced. And both the victim as well as the perpetrators of racism are living that experience. So when we think about, and you both work with youth and work in education in a variety of different types of capacities, when we think about right now, you're hearing it from politicians, from peacemakers, that white nationalism is one of the greatest, if not the greatest threat to the world today. And when you think about the education system here in America, because, you know, America has to think about itself as founded on violence and reproducing violence in a variety of different ways. But when we think about the educational system and what your experiences tell us, what might be some of those identifying markers in the American education system, both K through 12, as well as at the university level, where you see that there is a growing threat to an increase in white nationalism? Like, in other words, like, how is it being produced and reproduced through our education systems? What do you see it as? How do you see that happening?
I see it in curriculums that don't support young people's aspirations, right? Curriculums that are antiquated and really kind of keep folks in a space. So depending on what neighborhood you live in matters. From, like, depending on what neighborhood you live in for elementary school decides on what high school you go to in Baltimore, right? And so your parents could have done every single thing right, but because of what your zip code is, has dictated what your middle and high school is, and that has changed your entire trajectory, right? And so we have young people who are graduating 12th grade. I've done everything. I followed every rule. I was even on time for school. And I can't get a job making a living wage even after 2 years in college. A couple of years ago, Baltimore City came up with free college for Baltimore City public school students. But these young people were graduating, class of 2017, were graduating, going to BCCC, which is the community college, taking the placement test, and then finding out that they're going to spend 4 years in the community college because they graduated on the 3rd grade reading level. They graduated only being able to do 8th grade math. So I've done everything you said I'm supposed to do, and this is what I get. And then we have young people who did all of that and went on to 4 years, right? And decided to come back home after a 4-year education and are only making $32,000 a year, right? So I've done every single thing again, but this system is keeping me in this place of need, and then us social workers and educators are also on that hamster wheel of putting small band-aids. And so it's just constant need, service, and no one is getting out of it. But it is definitely it's starting for me, what I see daily is really curriculums and schools without the opportunities that young people are looking for, and curriculums that are not addressing the current aspirations of young people.
So let me jump in. I'll mention a couple of things. And so the question was about kind of like, you know, white nationalism. And I think that in some ways we might have some agreements and disagreements on what that is, what it looks like, how it operates, et cetera. I get that. And I don't want to make this too academic in the sense of we can't talk to each other. So I want to think about it in terms of white racial logic, right? So there's a particular white racial logic that informs schooling, K through 12, K through 20 in the US that we all have to contend with, negotiate, and navigate. And so, Mr. Simmons mentioned curriculum. There are very real ways that our curriculum actually perpetuates violence against our students, and it's because it's filtered through a white racial logic, right? All we have to do is look at the current policies and laws that are being erected about banning critical race theory, right? Again, I'm not here to tell you the tenets of critical race theory. One of the things that's really fascinating is that most of the folks who are trying to ban critical race theory actually have no idea what critical race theory is, right? But that's important, right? Because when you're in positions of power, you don't have to know the thing in order to limit it, right? And so that's why I don't, maybe these folks wouldn't identify, other folks might not identify them as white nationalists, which is why I want to frame what I'm saying in this kind of white racial logic, right? And that white racial logic has a very deep history that also informed why we didn't want to desegregate schools, right? And when we look in the aftermath of desegregation, who suffered? It was Black children, it was Black families, and it was Black professionals, right? Or we can think about the white racial logic that created the Indian boarding schools, right? Killed the Indian, saved the man, right? So this ideology of kind of denigrating people's humanity is built into the very fabric of our educational system, K through 20. We can think about the 1970s battles for bilingual education in California, right? This country has no national language, yet in schools, you can face punishment if you're not speaking English, right? So there are very real ways in which there's these kind of de jure and de facto policies and laws. But let me talk about curriculum, because I think this is really important, especially not necessarily in higher education. I mean, it's important in higher education. But what does it mean when you are in a school and you never learn anything about the contributions of your people, right? And what they've done. I'm thinking about Carter G. Woodson's Miseducation of the Negro, right? That in fact, what we learn in school is that we should actually hate ourselves, right? We begin to internalize this racism that we experience through the curriculum because we don't see our people having contributed much to what's been talked about. So I think about this, as an example, the curriculum ban in the state of Texas that outlaws teaching of divisive concepts. And I'm doing air quotes because it's subjective, right? Because the folks who teach evolution, like, that's divisive to me, right? World used to be flat. Like, who gave them the microphone, right? But this notion of divisive concepts allows for this complete subjectivity that is a slippery slope that some folks, whoever and whenever they're in power, can say, well, we don't like these things, right? Or if you've been listening to some of these, I don't listen to all of them because it's just a lot to take in. But I mean, there's rhetoric around, this might make white students feel uncomfortable. And so to me, right, I'm just gonna put on my CRT hat and say, well, it sounds like education is the property of whiteness. That if we're gonna organize our curriculum around making a specific group of folks comfortable, then the question I think we have to ask, I'll just ask it, what does that mean for the other students who are uncomfortable about what the white curriculum teaches, right? So I gave my students, this is not the question, I'm gonna sidebar, I'm gonna come right back. So I gave my students this assignment. I was teaching a race and ethnicity course last fall at the University of Tennessee, and I created this assignment because what I know through my lived experience and having gone through schools and et cetera, is when people are invisible, they become invisible. So if you don't have people around, they're not part of the conversation. And so I created this assignment where I asked the students to look in your hometown or choose a city and find out about an indigenous tribe that was indigenous to that particular area, find out what was their population at their height, find out when they moved, because they very likely are not there anymore, and why they moved, right? I had a student who was a fifth-year senior said, in all of my education, I've never been given one assignment that dealt with indigenous peoples, right? So I just raised the points about curriculum because there's a way that people can engage in schooling and actually be miseducated, right? So one of the things I tell young people all the time is don't let school interfere with your education, right? Because there's some things you need to learn that school will never teach you, right? And it's not accidental, right? So let me say a few other things. You were talking about Baltimore public schools. I think about St. Louis public schools, where about a 14-year period, maybe a little bit longer, their secondary schools, St. Louis public schools, secondary schools were not accredited. So what that meant that any student who graduated from St. Louis public schools did not have the prerequisite requirements to attend a 4-year college or university. so that if we create conditions that allow for this lack of accreditation in this case, we never have to worry about where those folks are going to go because their choices are already limited. And what we can do is, we as this ominous we, is step back and say, look at those folks. Why don't they care about education? Right? So you want me to go to a school where I got to go through metal detectors, people doing pat downs, they got a lockup room that looks like a, the prison. You hear people talk about the school to prison pipeline. I mean, we can talk about the school to prison nexus. There are very real ways, and I think one of the things that's most troubling is that we don't listen to young people. Right? Young people accrue a great deal of experiences in trying to navigate neighborhoods. I was that kid on Chicago Transit Authority, CTA, traveling to school, and my school wasn't in my neighborhood. So I started leaving home early and earlier so I can avoid certain neighborhoods and people in neighborhoods. So what was all the weight that I was carrying, regardless of what my GPA was and where I ended up? What were all the critical choices I had to make in order to keep school central to what I experienced? And we can exceptionalize my story, because I'm sitting here in front of you with a PhD, but what about Lil Pookie, right? Yeah. What about Lil John or Sean? Or we can think about those students, young people who are not able to make some of those kinds of choices, who are not able to be provided with particular types of opportunities, and then we condemn them for not achieving at the same levels as other people.
Can I ask Dr.
You can, sir.
I'm scared now. I'm prepared for Dr. Purifoye's question.
Change seats now.
Okay.
But because I think that, I always talk about this, and you hit it too, like this listing of young people and this supporting them and partnering with them. But damn, I lost my question. I'm gonna come back.
Okay. So let me say two other things, and you come back. So when we think about it in a higher education context, right? This country still suffers from the disparity funding of institutional types, and I'm thinking about public education in particular. So I think about historically Black colleges and universities. So in Maryland, the 3 HBCUs just settled a lawsuit that basically showed that over a 100-year period, the state of Maryland operated a dual education system where the historically Black colleges and universities got pennies to the funding that the
one is just a part of the University of Maryland
system, right?
Eastern Shore.
And you can look at Tennessee, where Tennessee State University is actually the other land grant college in addition to University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and they got a lawsuit. So why is it that we got to go to court to get you to do what you said you was going to do, right?
It's the same as happening with the university I graduated from, Cheney University, the oldest Black college in the country, has been fighting in Pennsylvania for the last 3 years around it started off as accreditation, but ultimately it's about the land that Cheney sits on. And all of the development that's happening in Westchester, the white community around the school, all of the development, and Cheney is in the way.
Yeah. So we can think about disparate funding at the higher education level. You talked about kind of K through 12. We know that, I think about Forward Heights in Chicago. I know most folks are not familiar with Forward Heights. At one point in the late 1990s, it was called the poorest suburb in America. They were so poor they actually had to sell the municipal buildings, right? How do we fund public schools? Through tax dollars. At some point, 70% of their residents lived in apartments. So there is just no revenue base to create funding for schools, so that if I'm a young person, my parent or parents happen to reside in Forward Heights, this is what I'm susceptible to.
Yeah.
Newark has the same issue.
Yeah.
Newark, New Jersey.
And the responsibility is put on me to overcome all of these things, right? And so when I think about, right, the ways in which this white racial logic, right, protects some folks, right? We can think about that from a class basis. We can think about that from a racial basis. We think about that from an intersectional basis, because I don't think we should separate those. I think about the things that our young people are asked to endure, right? We're gonna talk about merit, right? It took me an hour and 40 minutes to get to high school. And so if I didn't have my homework, like we can think about it, if I had not done well, it would have been because I didn't care, but nobody looked at my transcript and knew that I traveled an hour and 40 minutes to get to and from school, right? And so there's ways in which we create invisibilities in what our students and young people are dealing with, so that we can really have a greater appreciation for these kind of racial logics that inform and structure our educational institutions, that make some forms of education much more accessible than others. And then of course, just because I have to, we can think about student loan debt, as well, right? So I'll stop there because
All right, well, I'm going to move on to the next question, if that's okay, because we're going to be out of time before we know it. So you've listened to what you both have said to each other. And one of the things that we can conclude is that racism itself is violent. You know, you have people who say, you know, why do we even got to talk about race? Race is one thing, racism is something else. Right? But the violence of it is socially violent. They've talked about that. It's educationally violent. It is economically violent. It's politically violent. It's materially violent, and so on. And when I say it's violent, I mean that it's harmful. It causes damage. You don't walk away unscathed with racism. And, you know, sometimes people like to ask folks like, oh, can you, is this institution racist? You ask one person, right? Is the institution racist? And what kind of question even is that, right? Think so. When we think about today's theme, which is like, you know, dismantling or breaking down racism and building up peace, where do you see the connection between race itself and peace, since race has often been used to both create and sustain violence? So how is race and peace connected? And can we make the connection, which is what the International Day of Peace is arguing, and when race itself has been used to create and sustain violence? I'll let you start, Dr. Brooms, on that one.
All right. So I remembered I had a few other things to say about questions you asked, which has nothing to do with this current question, but I'll try not to digress.
Do you?
I don't know. I mean, it's just a lot, right? So, what are the connections between race and peace? Race is a lived reality, right? And there are very well ways that folks can make choices to try to insulate themselves from the realities of race, right? And we can think about this in terms of, we've seen research on like Black sounding names, right? Elicit less callbacks or less opportunities to even interview for a job. So just, you know, I'm reiterating your point and thinking about the various ways that racism impacts our lives. But I think we need to have some very real conversations about like peace and what peace is and why we need peace. I think for me, at least at the root of it, is without peace, we're all in trouble, right? I can sit here and talk to you about how Black folks try to navigate, make sense of, if you will, racism, but the reality is racism affects all of us, right? It affects us differentially. It affects us in different ways, and maybe today we're not as affected as other folks are. But the connections between racism and peace, to me, I don't know. I feel like I'm sounding philosophical, and I'm trying not to, because I'm not trying to pontificate, but it's hard to work towards peace when there's so many folks invested in profit, right?
And everyone's definition of peace is different.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, I want peace every day. I mean, but you know, so, yeah. I mean, so if we think about peace as its connection to racism, for me, I have to ask the question: what are the uses, plural, of racism? And if we're not willing to address that or those, then it's going to be difficult for us to get to a place where we can talk about peace, right? Because to a point that you made, Dr. Purifoye, like racism is embedded in the geographies, right, of this country, right? Where we can see things like food deserts, and we can talk about, as many folks here probably know, the ways in which Chicago is kind of always in the news for violence. But it's always about interpersonal violence. It's not about the ways in which we don't have access in some communities to quality healthcare services, right? So growing up, I knew that if I ever got hurt, I'd never wanted to go to Jackson Hospital. I don't know if folks are familiar with Jackson Hospital, but they got a cost menu when you walk in to let you know what you might be able to afford at that particular hospital. What way is that not violent? That we can only service you if you can pay for it. So it's structured into our daily lives. You raise the point, like, not only are we both aware of it and we see it, but because it's so normalized, we actually don't see it.
We live and breathe it, right? It's a part of It's a part of our DNA, which is crazy. And just listening to you, I've heard just thinking about this space of becoming uncomfortable, right? And for any change, for any of us to make any kind of change, it's this thing that we have to become uncomfortable, right? And that again takes us off of that hamster wheel of need and service, right? Being able to share space with folks, understanding that because I'm working on this change and because we're all working on this, that I might not have this job tomorrow because I got you to a place that you needed to get to.
Right.
But the system won't allow that. The system it keeps us needing and serving, and putting small band-aids on big issues. And just like Chicago, Baltimore is always in the news for, especially around young people, right? Young people are constantly killing and hurting one another.
So it makes me think about, right? So when I think about peace, I'm invoking conversations that I've had with young people, and there's very real ways that they are socialized to anticipate violence, right? They're socialized to expect racism. So I was talking to this guy who participated in this study about racism, and we were talking about racial stereotyping and profiling of Black boys and men in particular. He identifies as a Black man. And he was taking a job in a different state that was a good 16, 18-hour drive. And he says, at the age of 30 at the time we interviewed, he said, I'd never driven at night. And, I kind of asked him, because I didn't want to leap to any assumptions. And I kind of asked him about it. And he said, I don't want my family to get some call in the middle of the night that folks can't find me. Right? So it takes me back to civil rights movement, and it didn't have to take me that far, right? It takes me to the various ways in which racism operates that creates a disembodied experience as well, right? So when I think about peace, I think there's a couple of things. I think at the micro level, one of the things I'm very much invested in is just helping young people identify, to your point, their own realms of peace and what that means for them. And then building coalitions, amongst each other and perhaps with some of the institutions or organizations that they engage with to work towards creating a sense of calmness so that they have places, right, that they can go and know that they might, even if it's temporary, to be insulated from the various ways in which they're trying to navigate all of the things that are been thrown at them. I think we've benefited greatly, and I hope that we don't miss these opportunities where, given the pandemic and the restrictions that we had in terms of being out, and we couldn't ignore things, right? So, I still struggle with people saying the aftermath of the George Floyd murder. It was like Breonna Taylor was killed, Tony McDade was killed, Oscar Grant was killed in 2009, Amadou Diallo. How is this disconnected from all of these other experiences? But when I think about peace, we got to think about that through our social institutions. So in what ways might our social institutions like policing and the criminal justice system and schools and jobs and social service industry and the health services, how might they reckon with the ways they might perpetuate harm on folks based on race? I can think about Black women's health when it comes to pregnancies, right? We can keep talking about those. So we can't get to peace until folks who are in these particular agencies, organizations, institutions are going to reckon with it as well, because we can all in this room talk about reckoning with peace, and then we go out and we got to interface with the service provider or with the health provider, and or with other folks. And so if we can't reconcile some of these things, then we will continue to walk past each other and contribute harm. I wouldn't say contribute, enact harm on each other. So I think peace. I think we got to, create it simultaneously at local levels, but then also in micro levels, but also at the macro levels. We can't wait on one or the other because we lose a lot in the in-between, but I think we've got to come to some concerted efforts. And unfortunately, when I think about this country, when I think about some of the things that are transpiring internationally, we are in a bad place politically. Where we're allowing particular ideologies to serve as ways to further divide people.
Right, thank you both, because one of the things that we see when we think about the work that even the Kroc Institute does it's hard to find energies to engage in international peace efforts when your national efforts, when every day you're experiencing violence. Like, how do you step to the side to be like, oh, but let me help over here in this country when every day you're being abused through systems, but also socially, but you're experiencing the economics. He mentioned Fort Heights. I went to high school with the town that was connected to it. I'd go to Fort Heights a lot. Fort Heights, which is in Illinois in the south suburbs. So when we think about, and it's, sometimes people want to have a Pollyanna view of what racism is and what can be done about it. But we do see like some cracks in the barrier, right? Where there's some sort of racial progress happening in America, and that can maybe extend to overseas. Before we turn it over to the audience, if both of you could just quickly answer for us, and I know it's a loaded question, but so just give me like one example. But can you see any way that racism itself can end peacefully? Especially as you mentioned before, there's so much investment in racism and it's profitable. And when you get to talking about folks and their money and folks in their status and folks in their positions, you know, they get to fighting back and they'll use laws to do it. But can you see any way that racism itself can end peacefully, even if it's in like small steps in one little corner of a city or one little part of a town? And if not, just say, nah, Dr. Pig, nah.
I don't know Dr. Pig. And I'll say that because like my colleagues and my friends who are other community organizers, one thing that we always say to each other, especially some of us that kind of been in it for a while, is that we can save our block. Right, we can do our work for our block, and hopefully somebody else on another block is doing the work that's going to help another block, and then ultimately we're changing the city. But I ain't changing the city by myself, and I ain't changing the country by myself, and none of us in here, because like you said, folks are so invested in keeping folks down, right? Because that's what racism is to me, right? And it just goes back into what I was saying. Like, folks aren't willing to give up their space, and they're not. The wokest of the woke ain't really ready to give up that seat or that title that they have, right? Now, the real woke person is really saying, all right, I didn't help you, and now you and I are in this together, right? But it's profit and poverty. And so as long as there are poor people needing a system and needing people to take care of them, then here we are. I want to be more optimistic.
That's why I threw it all out there. So let me see.
I want to be more optimistic, and I can say, like, for some things that are happening specifically in my little quarter of West Baltimore and the work that we're doing, I'm really excited because I see the change, and those changes are just in young people believing and loving and taking care of themselves. Right, so that's exciting for me. I don't care about what the rest of y'all doing. Right, I just want to make sure that my kids are taking care of themselves, are loving themselves, and seeing themselves as important people to the world, right? And that's what I'm doing with my folks. That's 21217 and 21229. Now, I can't say nothing about the rest, but it leads into the other work that's happening in the city.
Yeah. I'm gonna give you this non-committal answer. One of the things I think about is that we need to do a lot more work around language, because there's a lot of ways that we might use language to disempower people. And so I was thinking about, I was honored to participate in this Racial Equity Summit in the Netherlands. And we were talking with our colleagues in the Netherlands about racism, and they kind of stopped us. And they said two things that I still remember today. This was 2 years ago. And they said, yeah, we're not like you all in the US who are, what did they say? It was something like, you are consumed by racism, right? So last I checked, racism was international. Maybe that's just me, right? And then later on in our conversation, they said, well, you know what? We don't have racism here in the Netherlands because we don't even have a word for it in our language. And I said, that tells me all I need to know about where the commitments are. Because one of the ways that you can disempower people is to create or limit the language that they have access to describe what their experiences are, right? So in fact, what you've referred me to and helped me understand as you try to explain Zwarte Piet. I don't know if you all are familiar with the blackface Zwarte Piet that is pretty prominent as part of the annual celebrations in the Netherlands. And there were some colleagues who had been working on trying to end this kind of celebration. And so it's how can you try to explain, this is just me, Southside, Ph.D. is for the academy, because on the street, folks don't even care what that even means. So how can you explain to me that there are people who are labeled as migrants, right? We're just gonna use different words, right? We got migrants, and within migrants, they said there are Western migrants and other migrants. So we can otherize people without ever using the words like otherize. We can have racist experiences, right, without ever using the word. So when I'm taking a really kind of convoluted and complex way, is that one of the challenges we face to even get to peace is being willing to come together and have some dialogue and conversation about what's impacting us and naming it and what it is, and not attacking each other because I might need to name it in this particular way because this is how me and my people might be experiencing it, and it might be different from the way that you might be thinking about it. And because we can't have those conversations peacefully, it makes it difficult in some ways to believe that we might be able to end this thing that's been a fundamental feature of what we now call the United States, right? As this in this kind of Western hemisphere. But I'm also from, I quoted Malcolm X. I'm also from, Dorothy Heights School, the Selma Clark School, Septima Clark School, and the Dr. King. Hope is one of the most powerful weapons that we have, right? And hope is what helps us get through, even when we can't see the way to get through. So there's a lot of evidence right in front of us that would be very easy to point to and say, I don't see it happening. Like, racism in and peacefully, like, quit playing, right? But I think we have to remain hopeful, because otherwise what that will mean is that we stop doing the work that we do, and it allows it to fester, grow, and be so encompassing that there is no hope in ever kind of at least repealing some of it. So I believe in hope. That's really what I'm saying. I believe in hope because if I didn't believe in hope, why am I even doing the work that I'm doing? Right.
Great. Thank you very much. We now have time for some questions from the audience, and I think there might be one or two online, but we have time for a few.
Yeah, sure. Would you, Gwendolyn, do you want to have like a couple people ask questions? Like maybe we'll take like 2 or 3 questions, then we'll have the panelists kind of respond to them. Does that make sense? Or you want to do the mic or? Yeah. Okay.
So if you have a question, raise your hand or we can grab one. Yeah, there's some online,
Yeah, I think we gotta, and I think that's where like coaching.
Hello, thank you so much for this panel today. I just wanted to kind of continue on Dr. Purifoye's question regarding peace and racism. And if we just for a moment were to limit peace and define it very narrowly and discuss gun violence, how would you respond to the best way forward to reducing the fatalities and shootings we're seeing all over the country on the rise since the beginning of the pandemic?
Can I start there? I'm going to start and let y'all take over. With this, so often when we're talking about violence, we often focus on street violence, and that's interpersonal, but that's also a consequence of systemic racism and systemic violence itself. And I always tell my students, you mean to tell me we can put a man on the moon, but we can't solve that issue? We can find somebody hiding in a spider hole 3,000 miles away, and we can't. And so it gets to who is profiting off of it. With, the word of God tells us that the love of money is the root of all evil. It don't say that having money or being blessed is the root of all evil. It's that the love of where you project it more than anything else. If you follow the money, you can follow the source of violence and our unwillingness to do so because violence is profitable. One of my former colleagues, Dr. Peter KB St. John, always asked the question in his idea of peaceology of how can you make peace profitable? If you can make peace profitable, you can get more peace in the world. And that anger, that not having good food to eat can shape violence that we see play out in interpersonal ways. Not having a safe place to go to school. We require children in the United States to go to school in some form. If where you're going is a space of violence, and what I mean by that is material violence. Jonathan Colzer wrote a book about Shame of a Nation and savage inequalities and the smells that children in East St. Louis have to deal with in trying to be educated. It's dirty. And Mr. Simmons talked about the bus experience and taking an hour, 2 hours to go to school and all the things that you're experiencing, and you're hungry. And 85% of your community is dealing with state aggravation, such as an over arrest. And you also don't have the resources in order to help you grapple with all of that. And you're just a child, right? You're only 14-year-olds are children. 16-year-olds are still children. We have this thing where we say children must be protected by law. We have all these beautiful laws to protect children, but yet we have a system that violates them every day with impunity. And so we can't talk about street violence and bringing peace if we're not, because it's easy to talk about street violence in the fact that that's interpersonal. So fix the person and you solve the problem, and just keep ignoring the systems that directly and indirectly shape those particular problems that we see playing out every day.
And I'll just add to that, it keeps the young person in that community as the villain, right? It keeps those young people in that community as the problem to their own problem, right? When we just keep dealing with them and not really looking at the systemic issue and following the money, as Dr. P has just said.
I'll add some really quickly too. Thank you for the question. I just want to just invite people. It's not a challenge because you might not see me again and you might not be able to report out. But I just invite you to just go on Netflix if you have a Netflix account and just look under action movies. And just scroll, let's say there's 30 movies. I can guarantee you 20 of them are going to have on the image of the movie will have a gun, right? And so there's a way in which our society, whether that's Hollywood, right, and other venues, has some investment in, guns being a part of our society. Of course, we can talk about the Constitution. I'm not arguing, I'm not making a constitutional law claim here, but what I'm saying is that the appeal of guns is, for many young people, but for adults as well, is the idea of power, right? There are very real ways in which we tell people, both implicitly and explicitly, that if you don't feel safe, you should get a gun, right? I mean, in fact, there is legislation that's being passed in multiple states that says we're gonna mandate teachers to get training on how to shoot a gun in case there's a gunman come to school. Listen, I'm not shooting at nobody, right? Like I'm trying to run, I'm trying to hide, right? But the idea that's driving the policy that says we should arm teachers is that idea that then perpetuates the, easily availability of guns across our society. So then it makes it difficult if we're talking about reducing gun violence, because what we're really saying is we should have guns everywhere we go, right? And so that then becomes something that if, as we see more and more guns, let's say in schools and normalized, then that introduces young people to guns in a very different way, because I got nephews who play all those kind of Street Fighter games, man. They shooting up, they got a gun that never run out, right? In a video game, right? So there's ways in which we're kind of inculcated with, guns and what they're doing across our society that then makes it very difficult if we take it from that realm. But then when we add, what Dr. P mentioned, that there's some people who I won't name any names, but there's some people who are heavily invested in availability of guns in this country, and they are racking up profits year after year, even as our death tolls rise year after year. And I think we just have to ask questions about what do we value? I don't even think we can ask who do you value?
Thank you. Another question?
Yes, we have several online. To start with, one from Craig Zellowser, who works with the Peace and Conflict Development Network. He says, thanks for a great session. One question, as someone who's worked and taught peace building for a long time, is what can academic programs do to make peace building so much more equitable in research and practice? Is it focusing more on structural issues and economics, taking a more activist approach, or ensuring that the lived experiences of communities are at the center, or something else?
All the above.
All of them. all of them.
With the last,
put that
it's like
together.
all of them.
Like
Starting
all
with
of
the last one first, though, right? Like including the communities that you work with or work for in that work. It should be at the center.
Because aggregate causes require aggregate responses.
Yeah, and even our higher education institutions. So again, just being from Chicago, if I were to think about University of Chicago, and its kind of encroachment and going into the South Side, like Woodlawn neighborhoods, there's ways in which people have been displaced by higher education institutions, and there's an adversarial and antagonistic relationship between institutions and communities, right? So that when I think about what can academic programs do? I think we need to expose them, right? We need to help our students see those things and how they exist and how they might even inform their experiences, even though they've not chosen to do anything other than go to a particular school. I'm thinking about ways in which some of our K through 12 schools, in the name of education reform and all those other things, they've changed names or they've been torn down. What does that mean for people who still live in that community and they now have a foreign connection and relationship to an institution that no longer exists, right?
We've been able to push it, like specifically on that. In Baltimore, there are about 40 new schools, or 21st century schools, the funds that have come into the city. And what we've been kind of working with community folks to understand that a new school is for a new neighborhood, right? So you got to watch the money, you got to see what's happening, and then also pushing on the district to say, when you are merging these two communities, understanding that you're merging two communities along with a new school. So just because this is Baltimore, so just because this is only less than 9 miles away from each other, it's still very different neighborhoods, and we really have to be thoughtful about that. And that community should be a part of those naming processes, and that there should be some education. We had one school where the district kind of moved really fast, and the school's name is Dorothy Height. And the way that they got the name.
Dorothy Height, grandmother of the civil rights movement, just in case somebody's taking notes. Yeah.
And she's also fair-skinned, right?
Yes, yes, absolutely,
right.
Absolutely.
Well, the way that the district moved, so they took Simmons, I took your advice, but we had to move fast and said, well, so what was the conversation you had with students around it? Well, we just had a little bit, but we showed them pictures.
No, you ain't had no conversations.
Shirley Chisholm and Dorothy Height.
Right.
To elementary school students.
Yeah, they look the same. They cousins.
One's light skin, one's brown skin.
Right.
And Dorothy Height is this school, right? And so we've been pushing and making sure now we have families who are part of PCAB, the advisory board of city schools, who really are sitting in those meetings to make sure that education is happening and that communities are a part of this decision making when these new schools are coming. But that's exactly, we have to put those folks in the center.
So I'm going to loop that back to academic programs. I think there's ways that we might consider, how do we expose students to what's happening at the local level, right? And so we can build partnerships. Yeah. Us who work in higher education can build partnerships with community. This is what we were talking about in the car. Can build partnerships with community agencies and organizations and community folk, so that when there are things that are happening, that people might be invited to the space. Because what we can't do, I want to make sure I say this, we can't just go and show up and say, we just want to see what's happening, right? Because that can be violent for some people, right? Because you're not invested in us. You just want to watch, right? And we've had enough of that. Yeah. So that's why what you said is important. I wanted to lift that up and just connect that, so that we've got to make these intentional partnerships so that within our academic programs, we can expose students to what's going on, but I also think we can invite community members into our classrooms as guest speakers, right? Or we can invite them to programs and be guest speakers, because we need to hear from people in the community, because otherwise we're basically in the room talking to each other.
And also create some equitable opportunities for them to learn and for them to grow and to build in their own lives, right? One thing that I have to say with this work with Hopkins, and Baltimore, Hopkins has beat Baltimore up. Same as University of Maryland has beat Baltimore up. And so both schools are really trying their best to build better relationships with community folks. And so this is how our project really even exists. The Nobody Asked Me project really exists because no one ever asks young people anything, right? No one ever asks community folks anything. Stuff just happens. And over the last couple of years, these two universities, just as you mentioned about University of Chicago, is just eating up these neighborhoods and pushing people out. but at what cost, right? So today, my hat is going off to the university for tomorrow might not. Today is going off because they have really been very intentional. I mean, it's a part of even how I became a part of the project. As well.
Yeah. Thanks for that question, Craig.
I know that we are technically out of time. Take one more right from over here.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, we got students. Yeah, we got some students asking questions too. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
I would say we're not leaving, right? We're going to be here for a while.
Right, because we'll be at the reception, but we definitely want to hear you.
Yeah. Thank you. My name is Halkano Boru, Global Affairs Master Student, concentration IPS. My question is, how can we de-racialize peace studies?
Did you say de-racialize? I'm gonna put my head down and write, and hopefully somebody say something before.
Like smiling and looking at everybody.
I'm glad you asked that question
Because
I asked the same question during my orientation of how do you make sure that you're not further embedding whiteness and doing things from a white racial frame, saying that because that's still a superiority issue, right? It's still a supremacy issue, saying that I think that this is how it should be. But if there is not conciliation, right, and this is part of the problem, like in peace, you must be conciliatory before you can reconcile.
That's right.
With it. And so this is why I say that Pollyanna view of, yeah, it's hard. And like Mr. Simmons, it's uncomfortable, right? But it has to be part of the conversation if peace is to be sustainable. It's not enough to just build peace, but peace itself must be sustainable. And if it's not sustainable, and again, I'm on a bar from my former colleague, Dr. Peter St. John, then you're just going to come back and bring more violence back into their area. And he's like, yeah, we got to make peace sustainable with it as well. And so to do so, it requires constant reflexivity and reevaluation and reassessment. You can't be like, oh, we got it. We got the formula. It worked over here. We're good. When you got hundreds of years of racism, you ain't ever good, right? It's never enough. You got it has to, and so I think that that's one thing that has to happen is that intentional and mindful effort to ensure that you are not reproducing whiteness, a white racial frame, or white supremacy, which means, as we have said, that you got to get the voices of those who are living out the everyday consequences of the violence of racism and of the violence of violence, right? So the harm of ever having violence. So that would be one of the answers I think.
Yeah, that was going to be kind of where I was going to go with it, was just thinking about, really interrogating whose voices are being lifted and centered, and then, raising questions about who are we leaving out of this conversation, right? And I think we should go further and say why, right? Because I think when we get to the why, we can start to disrupt some of the normalcy that kind of operates within these spaces. And I think there's, we got asked this question, we didn't really get a chance to get all the way deep in it because we were talking about so many other things. There's a lot of folks doing critical peace studies work, right? There's a lot of folks, not just based in the United States, but in all 7 continents, right? So we might think about what are the ways we might, invite or connect with. I think long-winded, I'm gonna go real short. We need to collaborate more, right? There's people who might have different ideologies that will challenge us to think and see and vision differently. So that goes to the point about being comfortable with discomfort, right? Like if we just hear we all got the amen corner, we actually didn't learn a whole lot, right? And we are at a time where we can't be complacent in only speaking to the amen group, right? So I'm just thinking about that there may be, I'm using the word colleagues just from the standpoint of other people, right? Not academic colleagues, but there are gonna be folk in countries in Africa, there are gonna be folks in Asia who are doing critical work at the ground level that we need to figure out ways of how do we connect with them to learn with and from them, right? Because one of the things we also have to do, we're thinking about this internationally, is being sure that we don't take a US-centric approach, right? Because that's one of the things that I think kind of divides us. So I'm just taking what you said and kind of scaling it up, because there's ways in which we get into a room and there's a way for the white racial frame or the white racial logic to kind of dominate and be centered. And then we get into a whole lot of conversations about, well, Why we got to ask these questions? If we worried about questions being asked, we ain't getting to no solutions. So when I think about like kind of de-racializing it, it's got to, I think through those kinds of lenses. I'm not suggesting that that's the only way. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Adedoyin. I'm a Peace Studies and Psychology student at Kroc. My question is more focused on the sort of higher education system. So I'm part of the psychology department. We have a DEI committee, and I'm sure like other departments have various like different ones too that address DEI issues. But what I found is that is really a problem for me as a Black student is that we stop at just forming the committee and that's it. And so I'm sort of in this position where there is a DEI committee, and if I say, okay, well, you need to move past that. There's this idea of tokenism where we've given you a DEI committee. What more do you want? And so I'm just more or less asking because in our various communities within this prestigious university, it's easy for us to just stop at DEI committees and there is no real work. There's just conversation. So how do we push past that? And also because some of our white colleagues are not exactly conscious of racism in higher education, and sometimes the work doesn't benefit them. At least they think it doesn't benefit them. So they're lazy at the work. How do we as Black students within this prestigious university push for our white colleagues to be more active? How do we push past the tokenism of just establishing DEI committees with no work behind them?
Okay. This is Derrick talking. I want to acknowledge that I chuckled when you said, and I write notes when people share, we've given you a DUI committee, what more do you want? I chuckled because I've heard that in meetings and committees that I've been on, which is one of the reasons why I don't like being on committees, right? One of the things we say is that committees are where good ideas and good people go to do nothing. And so we have to, you know, as a Black student or other students, I'm gonna think inclusively. I'm not, this university is 3% Black, right? So there's a very real way that Blackness is already both invisible and hypervisible, right? You take away the football team, it might be 1.6%, right? with the Coach Freeman too. Okay, so I used to work at University of Cincinnati, so that was just me. I don't know him personally, but I do know he's coaching you. So a couple of things is that, you know, for Black students in particular, because that's your question, I can think of other students of color as well, we have to be very clear on why we are on a committee, right? We cannot allow ourselves to be signed up for tokenism because we will, right? You look at any, I'm gonna leave that alone. I'm gonna come back. We can talk about that in a second. I was gonna make a comment about brochures and, you know, they make them look all pretty and look at all these Black students we got, and you get there and it's like 2 Black students. And they both was in the picture and they both graduated last year, right? You get there, you throwing up, you know, Marvin Gaye, you made me throw up both my hands, like what's going on? So I think, and I'm saying this for Black students, I'm saying this for Black faculty, I'm saying this for Black staff. We have to be very careful about where we invest our energies because there's a very real taxation that we experience when we are called into being on a committee under the banner of DEI, but it ain't going nowhere. And what too many folks, and Mrs. Simmons mentioned is, too many folks are invested in the showmanship or the performative work, right? Where, oh, we formed 3 committees. Okay, what's your committee budget? What's the strategic plan? What's the intended outcomes and how do you plan to get there? Those ain't never part of the conversation. It's, we set up the committee, right? And we got some Black people, we got 2, right? Like, so there are very real ways in which, and this goes back to what we've kind of all said in different ways, there are very real ways in which people benefit by making claims about what they've done. This is personal, so if y'all allow me to share. So when I got to a previous university, we got assigned mentors, and I told y'all, I'm anal about language, because people use it too flimsily. And so I was assigned a mentor. We never met once about my work. but you looked at that person's CV, and on their CV it said, I mentored Derrick Brooms. I'm ready to fight. Because I'm like, you ain't did nothing, right? But there are people who are benefiting off of being able to say that they've mentored me. And I use that to say there are people who will pad their resumes or CVs or dossiers or files and say, look at all of these things I put in place. We need to ask, what were the outcomes of those things? So I'm saying a couple of things. So number one is we need to be careful about which committees we join, because sometimes committees are not intended to go anywhere. That's number one. Number two, just because I'm on a committee don't mean I got to stop doing the work. Maybe the people that I'm on the committee with ain't trying to do the work, and I ain't going to be fighting them. I ain't going to be on the committee fighting some folks to do the work that I know need to get done. So from a student perspective, you got to be real careful with the energies that you expend on trying to improve particular units and spaces that other folks are not committed to, because otherwise you will that will end up being a distraction for what it is you actually came here to do. And so we have to be real careful with that. The third thing is that we gotta push back, and it can look a lot of different ways. And I'm right there with you when, you know, some of our white colleagues, white peers, we can be even. What that got to do with me? It got everything to do with you, right?
I guess I was the black person on that other end. So when I was with the health department, I was the director of youth and trauma programs for the Baltimore City Health Department, and you know, it's the end thing to have that, you know, that committee. And I would always say, well, why do I need to be there, right? When are you inviting your white folks, white colleagues to be there to have those conversations? And so what we did in that same push, because we were having the same situation, we ended up creating two groups, right? And so there was a space for people of color, not just black people, but people of color, right? And we would meet one Friday of the month. And at that same time, the white folks in the building who wanted to do that work would also have that meeting. So it wasn't a meeting we would probably get together every quarter, but every month the groups met separately.
And just to that, another just quick example is that when I first got to University of Cincinnati, because I've already referenced it, I got invited to be on the social sciences DEI committee. I just said, can you tell me who else is on the committee? I'm not gonna sign up for something if I don't know who else is there, because I need to get a baseline of their level of commitment. And so I think we have to take those kinds of stands. And the other thing we got to do is kind of, you know, in the ways that we can. I know it's different when you're a student, so I'm not trying to act like you just go in there and flip the desk over, right? Like just, man, this is bogus. You know, we have to, and Mr. Simmons just mentioned this, I want to just elevate it. We have to build coalitions, right? None of this work. We've referenced civil rights movement, and we can reference Black Lives Matter movement, if we will, but none of those things happen with only one folk doing the work, right? All of this work, when you talk about creating change, it's coalitions, right? It's collaborations, it's collectives, it's people working together. And the other thing, you know, that we'll have to acknowledge is that we got to figure out what work we can do in our capacity, and we got to make sure that we're working with some folks who are going to be coming behind us. Because sometimes people will be like, man, look, Derrick going to be gone in a year, right? Let's placate him. We're going to get some things in order. We're going to have a little reception with some crackers, and we're going to invite him and his black friends. And you know, he's going to be gone from the university in 3 weeks. And then that's it, right? So we got to think about how do we, you know, you're talking about sustaining peace. How do we sustain the work and the efforts so that if Mr. Simmons, you know, something happens and he just moves to Chicago, Chicago, because we can use him doing that work in Chicago, then who's going to pick that up in Baltimore and move that work forward? So we have to be thinking about how do we sustain our efforts, and it's not just me, it's not just us, it's not just this small group, but how do we work collaboratively? Because I can guarantee you that there's some other folks who are differently identified racially who may be invested in trying to make some of that change that you all are making. And you just got to figure out ways to identify with those folks and build those coalitions. Because this is, you know, when we talk about racism, just as an example, this ain't no people of color problem. This is a people problem, right? People created it, people are invested in it, people profit off of it, and people are disadvantaged because of it. So how do we bring people together so that we can work more effectively, perhaps even some ways efficiently, but we can sustain it beyond my time, your time at this particular institution, and we can move forward?
And I would have given pretty much the same answer, that the strategies have to be clear, but that justice must be part of it. It can't just be diversity, equity, inclusion without justice being, because justice is the action work.
That's right.
right, that requires it and can be sustained. I know we're out of time and it's time for the reception, so we can take more questions at that time.
Yeah, absolutely. I would enjoy and invite all of you to continue this conversation right outside these doors. And I just want to, first of all, thank you, Gwendolyn, for bringing such terrific panelists here from out of town and for leading a really, really important conversation. And I hope this is just the beginning of this conversation. We can continue to have these conversations here at Notre Dame. So thank you very much. Yeah.
All right, I want to give a special thanks to Mr. Larry Simmons.
Yes.
And Dr. Derrick Brooms for traveling all the way here to the glorious South Bend, or I'm sorry, this is technically Notre Dame, Indiana.
Kroc Institute, not Kroc Center.
Right. For the opportunity. Thank you all for sitting patiently. And like I said, it's just the beginning of a conversation that will have to happen for decades and centuries.
Yeah.
But I want to bring you back in, right? Because ain't none of us gonna be here in a century, right? But these are conversations that we need to be working on throughout the academic year, right? Let's stay present, right? And then think about what are we building toward for next year, right? And hopefully the folks who come after us will keep it going, for decades and a century. Because I don't know if I want to be around in a century, even if I could. No, I'm straight. Thank you all.
Go enjoy snacks.